In this example, we are going to take a look at how we can animate a ball bounce animation just like this one. This is one of the most core things to learn when it comes to animation fundamentals, and it allows you to practice a few animation principles at once. So let's just take a look at how we can do that. For the reference, we're going to be using this image here, and essentially it shows the motion path of a bouncing ball from left to right. And so the numbers indicate frames. The red line indicates a motion path, which is these kind of arcing motions. And you can notice that as it goes from left to right, it has descending energy, which means each time it bounces, it loses energy. So it doesn't bounce quite as high. And it doesn't go quite as far on each bounce until finally it comes to close to a resting place here in the last frame. So we are going to take this image and bring it into Blender. I'm going to go into an orthographic view by clicking on X, and let me go ahead and bring that image in by clicking, dragging, and dropping. It'll bring it in as an empty object with a plane attached to it, or sorry, not a plane, an image attached to it. So we can move it here into alignment. Let's go ahead and remove our default cube. Zoom in. Okay, so basically just aligning this ground indicator here in the reference image with the y-axis here in the viewport. So what I want to do is create a sphere that's going to approximate this object. So Shift-A, we're going to add a UV sphere. And let's just bring it over top. I'm going to go into X-ray. Let's zoom in here. Oh, I forgot to turn on screencast keys. Let me do that. Okay, so now I'm going to scale this down. And let's see, I want this to be the real size of a soccer ball, which I know happens to be around 9 inches. So if I make this 9 with quotes, then it will make it 9 inches, which is 0.229 meters. So that matches my reference as well, because I actually generated this reference image from a Blender animation that I made previously. So here on frame 1, you can see I've got it aligned. It's pretty much where it's supposed to be and what it's supposed to look like. I'm going to drag this timeline up a little bit so I have a bit more space for it. So in the timeline, we have these frames. We can drag the play handle across the frames. You'll see that the frame indicator changes as we move this, which means you can type in frame 1 here and it will jump the playhead to frame 1. We can also crop our timeline. In this case, let's crop it to 31 frames. That way we are just looking at our animated timeline area. Okay, I think right now the best way to get started would be to just go frame by frame, essentially moving this sphere into place. And I'll talk about why it changes shape as we get to frame 6. So the easiest way to do this is to click on this auto keying button. And so what will happen is if I move an object or make any changes, it'll auto keyframe it. So you want to be really careful that this is only turned on when you want it to be working. But essentially if I move this object and then I drop it, it will, you can see, add this keyframe here. And the keyframe in this case corresponds to location. I didn't rotate it, but if I rotated it, you can see it automatically added rotation keyframes. And if I scale it, it'll add scaling keyframes. I'm going to undo that. So this isn't maybe a perfect, pixel perfect diagram. So the motion path I just drew in Photoshop, so that's not going to be perfectly aligned. But let's just get going here. So frame 2, I'm going to press G to move, and we're just going to, now I can't just jump to frame 3 because I didn't move the playhead to frame 3. Now it keyframed this sphere on the wrong spot for frame 2. So if I just move that back, let's move the playhead forward 1, press G to move, And now I can essentially move each frame here on the timeline and then move the object and it will auto keyframe this. So I'm gonna just get this in the middle for now. I'm gonna come back and change this squashing and stretching later, but you can kind of think of this as an exaggeration here in 3D to make it look like this ball is getting some motion blur or something like that. It's called squash and stretch in traditional animation. It's one of the 12 principles. It's this idea that you can signify speed and motion by altering the drawn shape of the object. So let's go here to frame 6 and keep going. Let's try to get that somewhere in the middle of that. Frame 7 here, it's going to be around there. Let's go to 8. Okay, if you accidentally pop back out of your orthographic view, just click on the X and you'll get back into it. I don't think I quite aligned that. Just so you can see what we have so far, I'm going to zoom out and just kind of pan around. Right, so that's kind of what we're driving toward. So that's smooth motion. Okay, let's go back to frame 9, jump into X here, zoom in, press G. It's going to keyframe that. Oh, I forgot to move. That's going to trip me up a few times, I'm sure. Okay, let's go to 11, 12. So this is, at this point, since we're keyframing every single frame, this is akin to a hand-drawn animation. Very manual process. So we will take a look at how to automate some of this going forward, so that way you can make use of Blender's ability to interpolate keyframes rather than you having to keyframe every single frame. All right. Okay, so 21, 22, 23, we're still on track. Let's go to frame 24. And you'll notice that there's more distance between these. Essentially, as this object moves faster, it changes the kind of distance between its previous location for that keyframe. That suggests speed. Okay, we're almost done. And so as it gets to this end, there isn't as much change in location for the same amount of time. So the keyframes kind of indicate time. So if we have an animation that's 24 frames per second, that means 24 frames per second. So this is where 1 second is with that type of setting. There can be different frame rates, typically depending on the work. You might have something closer to 30. If it's more of traditionally hand-drawn animation, you might have 12 frames per second, but 24 is what we do here in 3D animation, and that's kind of the film standard. So if you ever watch a movie, it will likely be 24 frames per second. It's kind of the magic frame rate for film. Okay, so let's play this back. I'm going to, let's go up here and hide our empty. Let's play this back. Okay, it seems like it's working pretty well. All right. So now what we can do is come in and start to add that squash and stretch. So I'm going to come down to frame 7. We're going to start here. I am going to open up the scale handle tool here. So on the left, if you don't see your tools, you can press T on the keyboard and that will pop them out. I like to have the on-screen scale tool available because using the key commands in this case is an instance where it might be slower to use the shortcut keys. Okay, so I've changed the scale of this, and you'll notice if I go back here, the scale is not changing back. And that's because we had never really keyframed the scale before. So this is really the first keyframe of the scale. So if we undo this, I can maybe go back to the beginning, and then we can press I, hover over the scale properties and press I, and that will insert a keyframe. Now when we come back to frame 7, I can try to match that. And essentially this is, as this object is hitting the floor, it's flattening, and that kind of indicates this heavy weight, and also the idea that this object can deform a little bit. So it makes it more ball-like in that way. So we're going to keyframe this here. The reason it didn't auto keyframe the X dimension is I actually didn't scale it in the X dimension. So it's only going to auto keyframe what I change. In this case, I do want them to be keyframed together. So I'm going to go ahead and manually override that. So if we go back to frame 6, obviously this is not oriented correctly. So we do want to do some rotation. So I'm also going to press I here over rotation. Let's go back to frame 6. We can now rotate this, and we'll see here that the scale handles are not aligned with the object. Let's go ahead and change this from global to local for our controls here. And the reason that I'm squashing after I stretch is because an object has a volume. And so if you stretch a volume, it gets skinnier to maintain that same area inside. If we went and just stretched it like this, it wouldn't look quite right because it would actually give the appearance of it getting larger. If I did something like this, I would need to make it very skinny, kind of like this. And that would maintain the same volume for this object. Okay, so that's kind of why we're doing both squash and stretch here. And that's why the animation principle is called squash and stretch. All right, so let's go ahead and keyframe. Press I to insert a keyframe for rotation. And let's come back here. Okay, and maybe we will rotate that a little bit. Okay, and scale here, we're going to go ahead and just put 1 in. Oops. So when I scaled this down, I did not, unfortunately, apply the scale. So we've always been working with a scale of 0.114. So that will make it a bit harder. So if I do Control A, apply scale, the problem with doing it now is now it's going to throw our scale off. So make sure before you start animating, you apply the scale. All right, so that's kind of a hard lesson learned. Even I forgot, and I've been doing this for a long time. So let's go ahead and scale this in. And basically that just makes it harder for me to zero this back out to a scale of 1, because we never really had a scale of 1 to begin with. Okay, so just to kind of show you where we're at. Okay, we're just following along with the arc here. And so let's proceed and do the rest of it. Okay, so let's rotate. If we grab this square handle in between these two, that will do both at the same time. Okay, these still look good. And now on frame, let's jump to frame 17 and then we'll go back. So I'm just pressing R on the keyboard to access rotation. I'll just keyframe both of those. Let's go back to 16 and we can rotate this. So one thing you can do is if you lose your scale, we can come back to one that we know is correct. So we're getting this interpolation between this one because I didn't keyframe these in progression, meaning go from frame to frame and keyframe every attribute. We are getting some interpolation. So that's what the green means. Essentially, there's interpolation between two keyframes. So if we consider that this is sort of the size our object usually is, we can paste that, and then we can keyframe that here, and then we can keyframe that here, and now everything in between this one, frame 15 to frame 9, will remain unchanged because there are keyframes to maintain that that setting. So let's go here to frame 16. That one looks good. Okay, frame 18. Because I'm keyframing every single frame in this example, I don't need to worry about rotation, meaning I don't need to worry about whether I'm rotating it this way or this way. Technically, if you are going to have Blender figure out what the next attributes are going to be, meaning like what these numbers are going to be automatically, rotation would be important. But in this case, it doesn't matter because it has no room to interpolate any frames. Interpolating means calculating what that frame is automatically. Okay. Okay, let's just keyframe these. And I have already saved that copy of these settings earlier, so now I can just press I, and actually we can go ahead and insert a keyframe here since we know that we want this one to stay, and now I won't have to worry about correcting that later because I'm about to change it when I get to here. So let's rotate this here, squash, stretch that object, and technically it would get a little bit smaller. And I think we're going to be still exaggerating the shape here as well. So let's just get through these last couple. Okay, I'm just going to keyframe these here so it doesn't change scale, and then we will match that as well. And then last frame, I can paste those back in. Okay, so that's it. Let's go ahead and turn off our empty and see how it went. So I'm going to go into side view here. Let's hide this panel, and I'll make this full screen. Control space bar on my keyboard will just pop us into full screen for this panel. Let's press space bar and play it back. Okay, let me try that again. Okay, so that's not bad. Maybe a little bit over exaggerated on kind of the bottom squishiness on the ground. So maybe a very deflated ball. but overall feels like a fairly natural ball bounce animation. So that's kind of the baseline of what you want to get. With an animation like this, you would want to tweak the timing and spacing to kind of be perfect, but that can take a lot of work to do. As you saw, if we have a really long animation, doing that to every single frame of the animation can be pretty laborious, and that doesn't really take advantage of what software gives us the ability to do, which is sort of automate some of that. So we can now, in the next part, take a look at how to take advantage of 3D software's ability to interpolate some of these keyframes for us. If we now go to the object and select it, and then go to this object properties tab here on the right, if we open up motion paths, that will allow us to create a calculation of where this object will be, and it will also ID it by frame. So what you want to do is click on calculate, and then I'll just say all keys, and that will do from 1 to 31 here, which is what my timeline is set to. And now I'll click calculate. Now I can actually see the motion of this object over time. And what's nice about this is I can come in and say, oh, frame 19 is kind of weird because it's moving in almost a straight line. So I might want to go in at some point and maybe nudge that, or maybe frame 18 or frame 20, one of these could be slightly off. Another one that's kind of weird here is frame 26 and 27. This seems to go in the opposite of an arc. So really it should be arcing over to the right, and instead of kind of arc straight up. So that's not great. So I probably want to go and even this out as well, just to make sure I'm getting the natural motion that I'm trying to create. But this is a good analysis tool. So when you create something like this animation, I would recommend just going and clicking on that, and that will help you see that you have the animation set up properly. And to capture it, you can do, let's go into a camera here, and let me just quickly change the orientation of this camera. So with the camera selected, let's change the rotation here to 90. Let's turn off auto keyframe. I forgot and I left that on. And so what happens is anytime you move the camera, it will keyframe it. So make sure you turn off auto keyframe. That will definitely get you at some point. I'm going to go ahead and zero this out, and then I believe it's 90 there too. So now I have the rotation of my camera is 90, 0, 90. And now I'm essentially looking in an orthographic perspective. And if we go to our camera settings, you can see I have it here set to orthographic. And that will give me a perfect side render of this animation. So I'm going to leave it on keyframe 1, and I'll just go ahead and do view, viewport render image. And now what it does is it gives me this viewport render of my image. I can now go ahead and click image, save as, and just call this viewport render and just save that out. To give the object a sort of 2D drawn look, let's go to the shader editor. So pull up the panel here for the shader. You can see here that I have 3 nodes plugged into the material output surface input. So I'm just going to remove these, and what you might have is something like, well, you might not have anything if there's no material applied. So if we just close out this material, now we kind of are back to default. So to create a new material in the shader editor, you can click on new here. Obviously you can go to material properties like you know how to do and add one through the panel on the right. The default is the principled BSDF. So what I want to do is just remove the principled, and we're going to do Shift A, and we're going to go ahead and add a Fresnel. So it's spelled Fresnel, Fresnel, and this essentially calculates a reflection around the sides of the object. We're going to use this as a way to draw an outline. Okay, so let's go ahead and add an emission shader. And so if we take a look at what this is doing, let's go to render preview here, and we're in Eevee, so it should render really quickly. So we can change the color if we want. I don't know, you can make it blue or something. You can't really just plug the Fresnel into color. It will give you a color output, but that's really just kind of showing you reflection information based on this property here. So what we want to do is insert a ramp shader. So I'm going to just type color ramp here. Ramp shader is, I believe, the Maya term for color ramp, and I've not been able to call this correctly by its name since I stopped using Maya a long time ago. So in the color ramp, we can change it from linear to constant. And essentially what that does is it makes the transition from one color to another immediate. So we have a Fresnel plugged into the factor and the color to the color in the emission. So we can actually take this black color and then swap it to the right. I'm going to move this white one to the left, and now I can drag this closer to the left. And then you'll see basically it's crushing the color differences down, and now we're starting to see that outline be applied. Just to show you what that looks like linearly, this is sort of the linear change in color, and by doing a constant change, now we're not getting any of that gradation. So this is good. Maybe we want this to be a little bit thicker. If you change the index of refraction here, you can also control the thickness of this line. That just means the slider doesn't have to be quite as close. It doesn't really matter. This is pretty easy to control because it's a perfect sphere. Okay, so now we have our object and it has this shader applied to it that gives it a sort of drawn or hand-drawn look. So how do we render this out as an animation? There's a couple ways. The easiest way to just get a video file is to render it directly to a video file. So if you've saved your scene, so I'll go ahead and save. If you go up to your output settings here on this tab that looks like a printer, if you go down to the output folder, whenever you render an animation, it's going to put your animation render in this output setting. So if we click on this folder, you can see I've already done a render here of all of these frames. If I go up one, you can see I have a render that is an MP4 format, which is a video format. So you can go ahead and for now just render this out as a video, but I will show you how to do both frames and a video. So we're going to go ahead and keep this one selected here. I'm going to change the name on the bottom since I already have this. I'm going to call this video render .mp4. Click accept. And the reason that it's MP4 format in that that save preview is because under format, instead of it being a PNG, that's what it's usually defaulting to, I changed it to FFmpeg video, which is an open source video creation project. So we can now open up encoding, and encoding will allow us to choose the way that that video is packaged up. So in this case, I want to encode this as an MP4, and under the codec, I want to choose H.264. This is a widely accepted format that has decent quality for file size, and then you can change the quality. So we can choose a perceptually lossless quality if we want, and that will increase the file size, but it will give us a better quality video file. I don't recommend actually doing final animations using these video files because these are compressed. You can't essentially get a master render of your file. That's something that we'll talk about a bit later. For now, let's keep this set as H.264 under this MP4 settings. And now we're ready to go. When I go up to render, I can do render, instead of render image, render animation. And now it will go through and render each frame of our animation. So you can see here on the left, it's counting as it renders each frame. Because this is a really simple render, we are not getting long render times. So it's already completed frames 1 through 31. So that essentially has recorded that file on disk. So if we go down here to video-render MP4 and open that up to preview it, this is that file. And you might be asking, well, how do you set frame rate and things like that? So if we actually go up to where we have our resolution set, which is 1920 by 1080, Blender's default, if we scroll down, they actually have a frame rate setting as well. 24 is the default. Technically, I think film is 2398, but for simplicity's sake, we're going to stick to around 24 frames per second. If you ever have to match to other footage, you might need to change the frame rate to match, let's say, real footage that was filmed with a camera, for instance. Otherwise, that is how you can get your video quickly created. So the other thing we can do is get each frame of our animation put into a folder. So let's go ahead and create a new folder in our project folder called image sequence. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and accept our image sequence here, and let's delete this. Actually, we don't need to delete MP4. What we want to do is go to PNG or JPEG. If we're doing a real workflow where we need to control the quality, we want to do something like OpenEXR, especially if it's a principled workflow. In this case, we're just going to simply do PNGs because we're getting more of a preview of an animation at this point. So I'm going to change that to PNG, and I can change MP4 to PNG here. And instead of video render, actually let's delete that out. It's just so we have image sequence selected. And if we do render image, oh, sorry, that's going to give us an image. Let's do render animation. And so now it's going to do the same thing it did before, but we can watch it render. If we go into image sequence, you'll see it's doing 0001.ping, 0002, and so on. And so it's actually going to give us numbered sequenced images. And this is important because we can turn this into video footage later. So I'm going to open After Effects. Okay, so here we are in a blank After Effects project. So if I open up that folder here, what I can do is drag this whole folder into After Effects. Let me go to project here, open up that project tab. Let's try that again, drag and drop in the project area. And you can see it brings in that image sequence as footage. However, it brings it in at 30 frames a second. If I was to right click on that and go to interpret main, I can change this to be correct at 24 frames per second. So I'll click OK. Now when I drag and drop this down on my After Effects timeline here, let me maybe pop this into the right place. Okay, so I dragged the footage that I interpreted to be 24 frames per second down into the composition area, and it created a new comp for me. So now what I can do is just press the space bar, and it will have stitched those images back into a video file, essentially. Now in After Effects, I can do all sorts of animation effects that I might want to do. I can add text, I can change color, add effects that might enhance this animation. However, that's how you can get still renders into, or an image sequence of still renders into a video. Then you can simply go to export, send it to the Adobe Media Encoder, and then that will be a separate piece of software that will allow you to render this out as a video file. So I'm going to go ahead and open that and show you how to do that quickly. Okay, so here is the media encoder, and you can see here that we have our project. Because it's not saved, it has a weird output file. I'm going to change this to be the project that I had earlier. We're going to name this After Effects video and click save. Okay, and it's already set to H.264. There are other settings that you can change if you want. You can click on that. You can change these settings to be higher or lower quality. I'm going to keep this the default. You can also get sort of standard quality settings for different social media or video streaming services like Vimeo. I might do something like Vimeo 1080p HD. So that's going to be a pretty good match. And then I can click on the play button and it will go and render that file out. So it's done. Let's go ahead and open that up. And you'll see that it pretty much looks exactly like what we exported from Blender using that MP4 workflow from earlier. But that is two different methods to get the same animation out of Blender.